Hi guys, welcome back. This is Matt Chat episode 225, featuring the first of a brand new series of interviews with one of the creators of Rogue, Mr. Glenn Wichman. Now Rogue, as you probably know, is one of the most historically important of all computer role-playing games. It introduced the procedurally generated dungeons so that no two games are ever the same. It's really great stuff, and it really holds up well today. There's still many people who still play Rogue and any of the thousands of roguelikes and spin-offs out there. It's really great stuff. Anyway, we've got a lot to cover here, so without further ado, here is Mr. Glenn Wichman. Alright folks, I am here with the great Glenn Wichman. He is the co-creator of a game you've probably heard of if you know anything about computer role-playing games, namely Rogue. He's a game designer and engineer, and now he's working at Zynga. How are you today, Glenn?
I'm doing just fine, thanks.
I thought we'd start, I always like to start by talking about the background, what brought you to computers, how did you learn how to program, what got you into game design? Maybe you could sort of just set the stage as far back as you can remember.
Well, as far back as I can remember, which is like when I was 7, I wanted to either be a board game designer or a cartoonist when I grew up. So that was... my intent was to design games, board games. And then when I got to college and first ran into computers, I started playing computer games, adventure and the very simple text-based games that they had on the Unix systems at college. And I went, wow, the computer can do all the boring parts for you. Then, I think I'd like to design computer games. And so then I guess I'd better learn how to program these things. So that was kind of the impetus into it, was just a way to make my games easier to create and play.
You said you played a lot of adventure. For folks who don't know, of course, that's the text adventure game. I think it's Will Crowther. Who was the other guy on that?
Yeah,
Don something.
Yeah.
So what fascinated you about that game?
Well, like many kind of geeks growing up in the 70s, I was a D&D player, so and reader of Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and going to Renaissance fairs and stuff like that. So just the...
Oh, so you're the full package then.
Well, there were certainly people who were much more dedicated than me. I didn't make my own costumes or anything like that. But, I enjoyed that medieval fantasy, and the kind of the interactive fiction. It was a fun thing to do, to sit down and imagine yourself in these scenarios, and actually, rather than just reading what other players are doing, imagine yourself in the scenario and think of what you would do. So, which is, again, a lot of what Dungeons and Dragons was about. So it was the same thing, but you didn't have to get a bunch of people together. You could just sit down in front of the computer and do it.
Coming back to adventure, it seems I seem like I read an interview where you said you never actually beat the game. Is that still true?
I don't think I can't remember if I beat adventure. I never beat Rogue, which was the
what?
The thing that I remember saying in an interview. I can't remember if I ever beat adventure. I may very well have, but that's one where you can just keep pounding away at it until you figure everything out. So I imagine sooner or later I got it, but I was never as good at playing games as I was at creating them.
Yeah, it seems like one of the things that was a problem for games like adventure is, of course, once you do beat it, there's little reason to go back and play it over again, right?
Yeah. Yeah, which was kind of the whole point behind Michael and me creating Rogue was to create a game that we could enjoy playing.
So you weren't playing any of the games at the arcades at the time? No Pong or, I guess,
Oh
Pac-Man,
yeah,
that sort of thing?
Asteroids, which I never
Asteroids?
got very good at, and Centipede, and Galaxian, all of those sorts of games. I was pumping quarters into machines when I had the chance, and I could find some quarters.
But you weren't really, were you interested, did you want to make games like that, or were you more drawn to the computer side of the...
Um, I wanted to make any kinds of games. At the time, again, what I had available to me, this was people didn't have their own computers in those days. In high school, I didn't even know anyone who owned a computer. And then in college, I met, a couple of people who had built their own, but for the most part, the computers I had access to were Unix machines off in mini computers off in a room somewhere, and all I had was a dumb terminal. So I didn't have any graphics capabilities or color. I had, ASCII characters and a screen, and that was it. So, but yeah, I liked the idea of trying to do graphical games, and did what I could with what I had, and got more into that later when I had an Atari 400. That was several years later.
Well, the Atari, was that your first computer, the Atari 400, first
Yeah,
personal computer?
I was living in a house with a bunch of guys, and there was an Atari 400 there. I can't remember who actually owned it, but it was there for me, and so yes, I played with that some, and did some kind of Hubert-like games and stuff like that. So none of that was commercial. That was just stuff I did for my own entertainment in my spare time.
Well, let's talk about when you got to college and you met Michael. What was this meeting like?
Oh, well, so I was I was in what was called the stat lab, which was where the computer terminals were, and I was trying to teach myself BASIC, and I was writing a really poorly programmed text adventure game, and he walked in and looked over my shoulder and saw what I was doing, and said, "What is that?" And I asked him if he'd heard of adventure, and he had talked about how he had beaten it long ago. And so then we sat down and started talking and about games and how to program them. So then I don't know, we ended up just working on a lot of stuff together, becoming really good friends. So
what about Ken Arnold and John Lane?
okay, well, so yeah, that came later. So this is where kind of the history of Rogue was Michael and me, and then Michael and Ken, and then Michael and John. So Michael's sort of the constant, and so the four of us never really worked together as a foursome. It was Michael and each of us. So Michael and I were at UC Santa Cruz. Ken Arnold was at Berkeley, and he was the one who developed this library of routines in C called curses. Which,
Why do they call it curses, by the way?
Because it allowed you to do cursor addressing, so to place the cursor at a specific point on the screen. So normally, whatever letter came up next that was sent to the terminal would just come out at the bottom left-hand corner of the screen and work its way across. So most terminals had the capability to send it a special escape code to put a character at any point on the display, but all terminals and there were a bunch of different brands, and they each had their own capabilities. So Ken was the one who just put together a library that had a database of, if this is your brand of terminals and this is the escape code that you need to send, and made it so that the programmer didn't have to special case each of those things. So he had written that library, and we got a hold of it, and that was where we realized we had the technology to do much cooler games on these terminals than text adventures, that we could actually use the letters as graphics. So we got started doing Rogue, and then Michael and Ken started corresponding by email, and then Michael ended up transferring from Santa Cruz to Berkeley. So at that point, kind of the center of gravity of Rogue development moved to Berkeley, and there was not like a GitHub or anything like it in those days, at least not that we had access to. So Rogue wasn't under any sort of source control system where I could like check in and check out files. So once he left, I was working on it in Santa Cruz. He and Ken were working on it in Berkeley, but we were working on separate versions at that point. So that was where Ken came into the picture, and Ken rewrote a lot of the interface, and came up with a lot of different ideas. Michael met John in Italy, so both Michael and I left college and got jobs with tech companies, without bothering to graduate, which was fairly common in those days. And Michael ended up working for Olivetti, went to Italy. That's where he met John Lane, and John was the one who came up with the idea of actually making a commercial version of Rogue for the IBM PC. And so that was where John got involved. And because the code base that Michael and I had written, we wrote at the University of California with their equipment, we didn't really have the rights to that. And so John basically rewrote the game from scratch, changed the monsters so that we weren't infringing on any of Gygax and Arneson's intellectual property, and basically made it into something that we could sell commercially.
So when you and Michael were first working on this, nobody had any ideas about selling this thing eventually, or there's making a profit out of it? Or, why did you make it?
We made it because we'd played all of the adventure games that were out there, and we wanted to play more. And we had this idea of doing one that was graphical, and again, doing one where the computer would come up with the adventure. So we wouldn't, because we'd created a bunch of text adventure games, and I had written a program in Pascal that allowed you to create your own adventures, and so all of my friends were, even the non-programmers were, creating different text adventures. But
remember the name of that?
Oh, I don't remember. It was it was called Dome World because that was the first game that I had created with it. And again, that was never released commercially. That was just passed around amongst college buddies. Anyway, so again, we wanted to do this thing where the computer would come up with the adventure for us, I can't remember if when we were doing all of this, if we thought, okay, someday we'll do this commercially. There wasn't a commercial market for Unix games. Nobody had Unix computers, I think at that point I don't think, at least I was thinking that far forward.
I've been reading that book, Hackers, again, that one from Stephen Levy.
Yeah, I don't think I read it, but I'm familiar with the book.
One of the things that goes on about in here, and that I think is you see the same thing with Richard Stallman, Free Software Foundation, that kind of thing. They sort of paint this picture of that time as everybody's just sharing code. They're free, everything, all the software part is free, and that was actually a more fertile environment for innovation than, I guess, the later commercialization of it all. Would you agree with that?
I keep going back and forth on that. I've been thinking a lot about it, and the question of how you get something that's economically sustainable if there's no money coming in from somewhere, I think is an interesting question. But I think the amount of open source software that's out there that people just use nowadays, there's a lot of really good, useful things. And it does seem to manage to be sustainable. So I think for tools and other things that kind of all of us software creators are sharing with each other, it makes sense. I think for end-facing consumer products, it still makes sense to have a commercial model where you bring in revenue somehow. And I think what is the best way to bring in revenue for a game is still a big, wide open question.
So tell me about this, how you came up with this procedural generation concept. It's pretty high end or high concept sort of stuff, it seems to me.
Yeah, I don't think it was. I think it was really, again, just based on we wanted a game that we could play. We were tired of, if I created the game, then you could play it. But then if I wanted to play one, I'd have to wait for you to write one. So it was really as straightforward as that. And once we kind of latched onto that idea, then figuring out the details of how you make that work, I think, involved a lot of creativity and a lot of problem solving and a lot of running into things that nobody that we knew of had run into before. So it was a lot of fun, and we really felt like we were creating something pretty new and exciting.
And can you give me an example of one of those moments when you realized that you're sort of on your own new frontier?
Well, I think just when we sat down and we had an idea in our mind of what we wanted, level generation to look like. And again, we were 19 years old. Michael had more experience than me in programming. He'd been doing it in high school. I was really just learning. But we're looking at this problem of, okay, we've got this screen, 80 by 24 characters, and we want a level map, a dungeon level like we have in Dungeons and Dragons. And, I think initially in our minds, we had something much more wide open in terms of what we'd like the computer to be able to do. We ended up with something that was really extremely simple. It was just a tic-tac-toe board. There's just every level in Rogue, in the original Rogue, has 9 slots for rooms laid out in a 3x3 grid. But a room could actually be minimized to just one piece of corridor, or a room could be missing, right? And so we ended up with a very, very simple algorithm, not because we thought it was a good idea, but just because everything we tried that was more complicated, we ended up not having enough smarts to implement. But we did come up with something that I think gave the illusion of being much more deep than it really was, and gave enough variation that there was unpredictability and there was a sense of exploring, and that you could find something on a level that you weren't expecting. So
seems like one of the hard challenges to me, just thinking about the game, would be to make sure that all the dungeons had all the rooms connected with exits and you could actually get to the lower levels and so on. How hard was that to actually program?
We got in so much trouble with our friends. One of the great things that we had was we had a room full of people who were eager to play whatever we came up with next. Which is all the people who hung out at the stat lab. So we did have a bug where every now and then you would drop down a level and you'd be in a room that didn't connect to anything, and it ended up being called the Mars bug, and I don't remember exactly why, but it was infamous. Where we'd hear screams coming from somebody who'd gotten down to level 20 and had a really great character and everything was looking good, and then they ran into the Mars bug and they were just doomed. We didn't do it perfectly. We finally got that one solved, but it was not straightforward.
So what's your favorite gameplay story of Rogue? Something unpredictable that you talked about.
It was very interesting to see, to feel the surge of adrenaline that you would get when you saw a T appear on the screen, right? Because that was a troll, and that was like the first, as you got down levels, the first really threatening monster. If you were doing well, it's like, okay, I don't know if I'm going to beat this guy, and then I would sit back and I'd go, I'm looking at a letter T on a CRT screen, right? But my adrenaline is going, so just that was fascinating to me. How much you could really get into the game, even when it's completely abstract like that, and to watch people hitting the keys harder, hoping that would help them beat the monster. These were computer scientists. They knew that hitting the keys harder was not going to make any real difference, but they did it anyway because you were into the game at that point.
That story really, to me, brings home the point that you really don't need these advanced graphics. All these new consoles always talk about how great the graphics are going to be and so on. But, like I say, you got the letter T and get just as great of an adrenaline rush from that. Why do you think that is?
I don't know why it is. If we had the tools and the capabilities to do something with really great graphics, we would have. It certainly wasn't anything on our part where we thought, oh, we don't need these fancy graphics. They just weren't an option. But I think it is interesting. It's, in a lot of ways, I think it's like reading a book. If you read a Stephen King novel, right, it's not the same thing as seeing a Stephen King movie, but you still can have, your imagination fills in all of the blanks. So, which in some ways I think is, in some ways better because each person can fill in the blanks in their own way.
That's all for this week's episode. I hope you guys enjoyed that. I should be back next week with a part 2 of my interview with Mr. Glenn Wichman. A lot of great stuff coming up. We've barely scratched the surface of this thing, so stay tuned. A lot of great stuff. You're definitely going to enjoy it. As always, I want to thank you very, 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 very much if you have supported me in my efforts to keep this show on the YouTubes, as it were. If you like to support Matt Chat, don't feel like you have to give me a lot of money. $1 per episode is fine, whatever you can afford and you feel comfortable with. When you're ready to support the show, just go to mattchat.us. Look for the handy dandy support the show link. You can set up a subscription, one-time payment, whatever works, guys. I really, really appreciate it. Some of you guys have been suggesting that I look into this site called Patreon. I've been looking at that. It's very interesting. I'll definitely, hopefully, have a chance to roll out my own Patreon site soon. But in the meantime, there's always PayPal. Now, what about that ale of the week? Well, what else am I going to choose but a Rogue ale? Rogue's one of the best brewers out there. They've got lots of varieties, so thought it'd be fun during this interview series to stick with their various brews from Rogue. Let's see what it says. They tell you what the ingredients are: Cara wheat, crystal and pearl hops, free-range coastal water, and Pac-Man yeast. Well, if they're kidding about Pac-Man yeast, that's kind of cool. I didn't know there was such a thing. Guess there's a lot of retro gamers that are into brews. What else do we have here? Citrusy, pale orange in color, citrus grapefruit aroma. 15 degrees Plato, whatever that means. 76 AA, again, whatever that means. 59 IBU. So I don't actually see the percentage of alcohol in here. It's what I usually look at. So really I have no idea how that translates. But hopefully this will be okay. Now, also, I want to let you know that we now have a complete spreadsheet of all of the ales I've tried on the show, as well as the ratings and where they're brewed and so on. And that's mostly thanks to a viewer named James Dunn, who helped me. Some other folks helped out, but this guy really came forward and pretty much did the whole thing himself. So anyways, if you find that useful, say thank you to James Dunn for that. I definitely thank him. Anyway, let's get this Brutal open and see what it's all about. All right, so I've got some of this Brutal IPA here in the rather excellent drinking horn. I've been smelling this, and I'm really trying to give this a good snort, but I just don't really smell a lot coming off of this. It's a little bit of kind of a lemony-like scent to it, but not a really strong aroma to it at all. Maybe a little bit of a citrus, peachy thing. Anyway, let's give it a taste. What is that? So you get sort of a little bit of coffee, a little bit of nuttiness, kind of what you'd expect from an IPA. It's not very bitter, actually. It's a little bit bitter at first, but then it quickly goes away. You get a fairly nice aftertaste to it. I gotta say, though, I'm very surprised that they would call it Brutal, because it's really not much flavor to it. It's actually very light, maybe more on the refreshing side than the sucker punch you side. Anyway, let me give it another taste. Yeah, just, not a lot of flavor here. It's very light and, watery even. Again, really surprised. Usually Rogues are very full of flavor. They're very, very full-bodied ales. This one is very tame. Anyway, I'll give it one more taste. Yeah, it's just not doing that much for me. It's not bad, but there's just so many better IPAs out there, and I'm a little concerned that they would call this Brutal when it's in fact quite kind of wussy. Anyway, I'm going to go 1 out of 5 drinking horns on this. Again, not a bad choice, but there's just so many better IPAs out there, and life is short, so what can we say? Okay, let's wrap this up with a quotation. So for the quotation this week, I was looking for quotes about rogues. There's actually a lot more than I expected to find. I really like this one from author Henry Fielding, though. It goes something like this. A rich man without charity is a rogue, and perhaps it would be no difficult matter to prove that he is also a fool. See you guys next week.
Tell him about the Twinkie.
What about the Twinkie?